Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest TI Apply and IU European Road Freight Benchmark Report for Q1 webinar. We'll get started in just a moment, but we'll just wait for attendees to stabilize. And then once everyone's joined, we'll get going. Okay, it looks like attendee numbers have stabilized now. So welcome everybody to the Q1 2024 European Road Freight Rate Benchmark webinar from TI, Apply and IU. We're very pleased to welcome you all again for another edition of this webinar to talk about the latest European road freight trends and particularly focused on rate development for the upcoming quarter and looking at what happened in Q1. So today, of course, we'll be looking at the cost environment. Particularly, we'll be interested in seeing how the new tolls introduced across much of Central Europe have affected rates during Q1, as more of those have filtered through now. And we're also looking ahead to the environment for the rest of the year. The headlines really are that we've seen rates fall both for spot and contract again in Q1, but at the same time, we're expecting the demand picture to improve throughout the rest of the year. And we'll be discussing what that means for the rate outlook as well. Whether the low demand we've seen will keep rates suppressed, even though we've got high costs, or whether as demand returns, we're likely to see rates rising again. So lots of very interesting topics to discuss today. The session, as always, will last for about 45 minutes, 30 minutes or so for presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Please do ask your questions using the Q&A app during the course of the session. We usually have lots and lots, so it's good if we can answer some by text during the course of the webinar. And then we'll come to as many as we can at the end. After the webinar, of course, as usual, we'll share the report and a copy of or recording of this session as well. If you want to watch again or share with any colleagues, you'll have access to that as well. Okay, and finally, also there'll be a poll. So that'll be on about the fourth slide when we're looking at the overall European picture. They're just asking you how we expect or how you expect rates to develop in the future. So be prepared to answer that as well. Now, let me introduce our panelists today. So my name is Michael Clover, I'm your host, and I'm TI's Head of Commercial Development, representing Transport Intelligence, which is a provider of strategic market intelligence for the logistics and freight industry, with particular specialization in road transport. So if you've got any queries like that, we'll be happy to hear from you. I'm also joined by Nathaniel Donaldson, who's our economic analyst and leads our data team, and particularly the work on this report. So welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Michael. Hello, everyone.
And in addition, we also have Marianne Savoni, who's Associate Director, Strategy and Market Intelligence at IU. Marianne, would you like to introduce yourself and IU for those that don't know the organization?
Yeah, sure. So good afternoon to all. Briefly, IU is the World Road Transport Organization. So we represent road transport sector worldwide. We count around 165 members in more than 80 countries. We are, as an international organization, delivering key advocacy, we say, activities at a regional, but also at a global level. We manage and we develop solutions to support the international trade and the transport. And we develop intelligence and expertise on different topics and covering notably the interpretation of the regulation. So, for example, taking mobility package, Went and mentions, Fit for 55, but we also provide operational support on, for example, CO2 emissions, transport solutions in terms of intelligence and expertise. And finally, just to finish on this one, IRU benefit from a large diversity of members, being national road transport associations, but also large logistics players, service providers and shippers. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Marianne. And before we move on to introducing Thomas, I'd better just read the comment at the bottom here, which is that we remind you that all discussions and statements made by participants on commercially or strategically sensitive information may fall within the scope of competition law and be considered as unlawful. We invite you to refrain from sharing any information of such nature or entering into any such discussion, including during breaks. Now I can introduce you to Thomas Leroux, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Apply. And Thomas, can I ask you to introduce yourself and Apply for those that don't know you?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. It's always a pleasure for sure to be in this quarterly webinar. I think more than 1,300 registrants for this time, so it's still a huge thing to be here. Regarding Apply is a digital platform dedicated to supply chain and to transport management. We offer a variety of tools from automated procurement, sourcing for trucks, pre-post carriage also. And we do have a tool that is called Smart that is dedicated to analyzing the costs and the price for transportation on air freight, road transportation, and ocean freight. And we will focus today on the road transportation in Europe.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas. And if I could also ask you to just give a bit of an overview about the methodology used to provide the data
for sure.
Apply for today.
So our thing about it, so today we pick a bunch of data from Apply. These data are dedicated. This is the same data quarter by quarter. Road transportation data, FTL, full truckload only here. So no LTL, FTL only. We looked only at general cargo. We have more data regarding reefer, bulk, or rolling rollout. But here, this is general cargo. Spot and contractual prices will be shown. The fuel is included. We have also some slides where we can see the impact on the fuel, but almost all the slides that you will see and the graphs that you will see in the report and the slides will include the fuel. And this is on the right part, the global coverage that we have, so quite good in Europe. You will see some of the countries that we have in the webinar, but for sure, our tool you can use our tool to make any origin destination request that you want across Europe.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas. And we'll now move on to our first content slide. So we'll show you the overall index for the European road freight rates across all the lanes that we cover in this report. And this gives you the contract and spot rate development. Nathan, can you explain what's happened in the latest quarter, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Michael. So this is the latest, as Michael mentioned, the latest quarter contract and spot indexes. And I'd say the general story that we see is that both indexes have fallen this quarter. We see that the spot rate appears to be starting to normalize after some really big falls, and the contract rates are falling slightly now, but remain elevated. So if we look at the actual changes, we can see that the contract index fell 2.6 points quarter on quarter. So it's down to 127.6, but overall it remains elevated, and it is down just 1.1 point year on year. The spot index dropped more modest 1.1 point quarter on quarter to 123.9, and it's now down 8.2 points year on year. So generally, the overall demand story is that we're seeing some less pressure, so less downward pressure from demand across the continent. That's after lower inflation levels and a more stable demand environment. We're seeing less consumption falls, dragging the more sensitive and more reactive spot market down. So it's leading to fewer and smaller drops. And as a result, we're seeing that spot market start to normalize, and we're now seeing a lower level of demand, both from consumers and industries, but that is more stable and pulling the general prices down less. On the contract rate side, we're seeing that the costs remain elevated on previous years. So we've got rates that are still considerably up versus 2021. But we have actually had a few indications across the continent of some costs falling down slightly after being really pushed up by inflation and then the price rises that were pushed through throughout the economies in Europe. But we do also see a slight demand effect. So actually now at those lower levels of demand, both consumers and industries, we see some larger shippers, especially industries, trying to secure smaller volumes on new contract renewals. So it's adding less pressure to the contract rates, and we're seeing less pressure there. If we're talking about an outlook going forward, TI and IRU forecasts a growth in volumes of the road freight market anywhere between 0.4% growth to 1.1%. Now that's up considerably versus a minus 0.4% growth in 2023 as we look in 2024. But it still remains well below the 2022 growth of around 3.5% in terms of volumes. So really what this means is that we may see a more stable environment, potential for some increases later on in the year, but that is really dependent on how well we see demand rebound. And also it may still be held down by high interest rates as we head into it. So any serious growth might be in more close to 2025. But we do see that there could also be some supply side pressures. We're seeing geopolitical events across the world having some pressure and potential bottlenecks. But overall, a more stable market, rates remain elevated. The pressure probably happening more towards the later of the year, less downwards demand pressure, less cost pressure in the latest data.
Thanks, Nathan. Yes, and while he's been speaking, I did just launch the poll asking people their views on the outlook as well. But you know, it is interesting. You know, we obviously forecast a growth in volumes this year, and sort of anecdotally, from what you're hearing at the moment, we're starting to look at a picture where we're seeing more orders coming in, a bit of a restocking cycle through the middle part of the year looks to be occurring as that expectation for demand recovering comes through. And what we hear and see on ocean freight markets, on import markets, is that those volumes are increasing. Those prices with carriers are hardening, and we expect that to filter through to road freight. So we can think, even if it's just from an initial sort of medium term restocking cycle, more demand, applying more upward pressure to rates over the coming months. But it's still early days with seeing that filtering in to sort of imports at the moment. So quite early to be saying that. Let me just end the poll and share the results with you now, so you can see what you, our audience, thinks, as we've had about over 300 responses now. So I'll just share the results there. And you know, initially you can see slightly more in favor of remaining flat or increasing than perhaps in recent polls. Thomas, do you have any thoughts on those poll results?
Yeah, this poll result is always interesting to see, because we have a quite good number of respondents over there. You will see through the webinar that this is quite aligned with what we see on the market, what we see over the past weeks, if we are looking at for sure Q1 2024, but also the recent weeks. Clearly, we had a bump of prices over the past months and quarters, decrease over the last one. We, I think, reached the level where the costs, the price are very close to the cost, the margin are tight for certain carriers, and the prices will, I think, remain flat or increase slightly due to a start of demand again, and because of the costs. The costs are still very, very high. We will see that just after. There will be also a cost of shifting to a more environmental friendly transportation, and this cost will be borne by shippers also.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes. Okay, well, let's move on then to some of those costs which are sustaining rates. Then we'll start with fuel, and Marianne's going to take us through the next few slides.
Yeah, sure. So first, as a reminder, we consider here the fuel prices at pump in euro per liter. And the graph, as you can see, shows the evolution of the fuel prices on a weekly basis since the second week of January 2022 until the first week of January 2024 by country. So what we can say here, at the end of Q1 of this year, the average diesel price at pump in Europe was 1.68 euro per liter. So which is down 9% versus their peak of last year at the end of September. But keeping in mind that the level is still 10% above its January 2022 level. After that, we observe a continued falls in Q4 last year. And we can see that since the end of last year until the end of Q1, diesel prices have been modestly rising. And we can say that the average diesel price at pump is 3% up at the end of Q1 versus in January of this year. And this is mainly pushed by the rising crude oil prices. In terms of Brent crude oil price, they average $85 per barrel in March, which is a $7 per barrel increase compared with December. And this is the third consecutive month of average Brent price increase. So the main reasons behind that, first, as you know, this is linked with the high uncertainty and geopolitical situation, notably related to the attacks targeting the commercial ships transiting the Red Sea shipping channel, but also the general elevated tensions in the region. And according to the different experts, we could expect an increase and an increase of the intensity and the number of attacks on the naval and commercial vessels in the coming months. The other explanation of this of the Brent price increase is the anticipated extension to the voluntary OPEC Plus production cuts that were officially announced on March 4 this year. Back to you, Michael.
Thanks, Marianne. Yes, good praise of the fuel situation there, and obviously that's a core driver of costs. But the really interesting development over the last quarter, of course, has been the toll changes. So we've got a few slides to explain some of that, starting with this overview. And then back to you, Marianne.
Yes. So as you can see here, you see the map of the CO2 toll implementation in Europe. So the first message here that you can clearly see is that the implementation of the CO2 component for tolling is not uniformly deployed in the EU. And the main reason behind that is that the 2022 Eurovignette Directive is based on a digital distance measure for toll calculation. And not all the member states are using such form of tolling. So some of the countries have gated distant tolling, which is the case of France. Some other countries have time-based tolling or vignettes, which is the case of, for example, the Netherlands. Germany, as you all know, was the first member state to deploy the CO2 tolling component at the end of last year, leading to an increase of 0.16 euro per kilometer for the classic Euro 6 articulated vehicle combination. As we said at the last webinar, such increase leads to an 80% cost increase for the classic tractor and semi-trailer combination. Since the end of last year, Austria followed with Hungary beginning of this year, with cost increase of 7% and 40% on average respectively. And then Czech Republic started to implement the new toll in March, leading to a 13% of toll increase for the Euro 6 articulated vehicles. As you can see on the map, in the future, the next member states deploying the CO2 tolling will be Sweden, starting next month, and Denmark beginning of next year. The Netherlands are thinking of 2026, always as Romania. And finally, some highways in France, which is the case of the A35 in Alsace, could have a CO2 toll components already next year in 2025, but the CO2 tolling will be more massively deployed when the concessions will be renegotiated, the first one being in 2032. And finally, Bulgaria has indicated working on a form of CO2 tolling without a clear time frame yet, as of today. Maybe if you can go to the next slide, Michael. I will go through briefly, so it's a little bit complicated. So we try to simplify it with this graph. The idea is to present you how the CO2 toll is calculated and what are the class of vehicles that are concerned. And you have two approaches here. The one that you have on the slide is concerning Austria, Czech Republic, and Germany. And you can see here on the graph, the concept of CO2 classes is used going from the class 1 for the bigger CO2 emitters to class 5 for zero emission vehicles. For the most trucks and buses, except subgroups 4, 5, 9, and 10, there are only two levels, the class 1 for diesel and gas engines, and class 5 for electric or hydrogen powertrains. Today, the only 4x2 and 6x2 trucks and tractors with a gross vehicle weight greater than 60 tons are concerned by the CO2 toll. And for trucks registered after July 2021, and according to their vector results, when first registered, they can be considered class 2 if they are better by 5% than a reference value, class 3 if better than 8%, and class 5 if better than 50%. Class 2 and 4 apply for both diesel and natural gas variants. But all other vehicles registered before July 2021 fall into the class 1. And according to those vehicle classes, different CO2 toll is applied. And you have on the screen the example of Germany. If we take the example of Germany, it means that a class 2 vehicle offers a -2% toll reduction compared to a class 1 and up to 23% for class 4. And I will just go with the next slide, which is showing the example of Hungary, which is another, I would say, another example or another way of calculation. In the case of Hungary, all the vehicles will pay the infrastructure component of the toll. And then, according to the Euronorm of the vehicles, tolls for air pollution, noise, and CO2 are degressive. And only the zero-emission vehicles are exempted of the CO2 tolling component. I will stop here on this one.
Thanks, Marianne.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good to understand the inner workings and dynamics there of how those apply. So thanks for taking us through all that. Okay, so now we're obviously going to be looking through various individual lanes, and we can see perhaps not on the France-Spain one, but when we're looking at some of the Germany lanes, for instance, we'll take a dive into how the toll rates are translated into the rate changes. But we'll start looking at Madrid to Paris. And Thomas, if you could take us through this one, please.
Yes, for sure. So this is an example directly the price that you have on the left. So it's the average price for a full truckload between these two countries and these two cities over there to have exactly the exact kilometers. What we see first is that after a complete switch in Q3 2023, the prices of the two legs continue to diverge as the result of contrasting demand environment between Spain and France. If we look at the last data that we have from the OECD, Spain is performing on the top of all the countries. I think it's the third performing countries between the 38 OECD countries in 2023. Clearly, we see in Spain also a growth of the Spanish tourism, of the industrial production, even on the retail demand. So Spain is going very well from an economic perspective. This is not the case for France, where the retail volume for France have dropped slightly, but still decreased by 0.4% quarter by quarter. And if we look at some studies that have been made in France, 70% of the French consumers intend to continue cutting back their spending in 2024 due to inflation and the economical environment. So and this is what we see directly on the graph. If I can comment quite quickly, we see an increase still of, so for the one that are not familiar with the graph, the S is for spots. So the gray part that we see on the top is from Paris to Madrid, so import in Spain, with spot prices for the full truckload. The contractual are in black, and then you have in red and light red, let's say, the other way with spot and contract. And we see clearly a diversion over there. What is the forecast? What is the outlook on that? While when we look at the past quarters, 18 and Q2 18 or in 2019, for instance, rates were quite close together. Then we have the COVID crisis where the rates were crazy on the other way from Spain to France. Now this is the counter effect. Let's say what we forecast is that the rates should go back at a closer level. So they will probably, maybe in 2024, maybe 2025, go back closely together at a higher level for sure. Why? Because also France is getting better. The forecast for the economy in France is, let's say, for 2024 more positive. So yeah, this is the outlook that we can have, and this is also what is explaining today what we see on this specific graph.
Thanks, Thomas. Yes, it's very interesting to see this. Lane always tracks the sort of macro situation quite closely, and definitely still doing that. But let's move on across then to France, to Germany, and Nathan, you'll take this one.
Yeah, so this has been quite an interesting story recently. To just to show it is similar to the previous lane, showing the macroeconomic situation of both these major European countries, and it not looking hugely positive. But general prices are leading downwards, and it appears like on this lane the automotive sector is having a major effect on the prices. So if we look on the head haul, so as we're going over to Lille, we see that contract rates average 685 euros per journey, and that's following a 10.6% fall quarter on quarter, and it's now down 3.3% year on year. Now, if we look at the spot rate on the head haul, it's reached an average price of 691 euros per journey. That's after a fall of 6.6%, so slightly smaller than the contract on that one quarter on quarter. On the back haul, as we're going towards Duisburg, the contract rates fell 4.7%, so we've got smaller falls over to Germany. So that's 4.4% quarter on quarter and 3.3% year on year. So now averages 487 euros per journey. If we look on the spot market, it fell 2.7%, so a smaller amount still quarter on quarter, and it's now down 4.1% year on year, and averages 532 euros per journey. Now, what we had at the end of this year, as we highlighted this in previous papers, was that we saw a rebound in the demand and the production for cars as the supply chain effects dropped off, the supply chain bottlenecks, and allowed the industry to meet the demand that we were getting from the market, from the consumers. But we're actually seeing now that the German production is down. German production of cars is down 1.1% year on year. And it seems that this was only a temporary effect, and the automotive sector is adding a lot less pressure to this market, and has dropped off. So we saw them prematurely rising, the rates on this lane prematurely rising, but actually now it's more reflecting the what we're seeing in both economies, which is that the activity in the German economy remains low. We're seeing fall in retail in the French economy, as they still are affected by that lagged inflation effect. So it means it still has a bit more to fall, where Germany is settling down a lot lower. But if we take some numbers, for example, if we look at Carrefour, their reports from quarter 4 2023, we see that their sales, overall their sales was up 1%, so a small growth, but it was minus 5.8% in non-food sales. So we see that of those non-essentials, the French consumers are still consuming less. The outlook for this lane is that we should see fewer falls and an increased normalization in rates, but the overall situation remains weak. And actually, whereas we're seeing in the rest of the continent that demand is settling, there's still some further falls, especially from production. As we look for that long term, we see new orders down, and the automotive sector still is looking to put less pressure on this market.
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, so reflecting really some of the weakness in the German economy there, and we'll move on another lane that's looking at Germany really, but this time on the eastern lane to Poland. Marianne's going to take us through this one.
Yeah, sure. So very clearly, quarter on quarter, all rates have risen on this lane for both head haul and back haul. First, on the Warsaw to Duisburg leg, contract rates were 1.5 euro, up by 5% quarter on quarter, and spot rates were 1.6 euro in Q1 2024, which means up 4% quarter on quarter. And year on year, head haul rates are now down 3% in the contract markets and minus 4% in the spot markets. Conversely, on the backhaul, so Dries booked to Varslo leg, contract rates stood at 1.2 euro, up by 1% quarter on quarter, with spot rates at 1.4 euro, so up by 5% quarter on quarter. And on year backhaul rates are now down 0.5 in the contract markets and 1% down in the spot markets. Spot rates are consistently higher than the contract rates for both legs, as you can see. In the Verso to Duisburg leg, spot rates currently exceed contract rates by 10%, showing a slight decrease from the previous quarter, 11%. And similarly, on the Duisburg to Verso leg, spot rates are 17% higher than contract rates, increasing from the previous quarter, 12%. So what are the market pressure on this lane? Obviously, as we just said just before, the Q1 24 is the first full quarter affected by Germany's new emission-based tolling system. And this is clearly resulting into a significant rate increase, which will form part of the cost base going forward. It's possible that rates will rise further with the slight improvement observed in the consumption. However, it's not likely that rates will rise significantly as demand has not yet fully recovered. Just to finish on this one, the magnitude of spot rate rises will diminish as consumption is expected to normalize. Nevertheless, incremental decrease in the contract rates in the upcoming quarters seem possible as the pricing pressure alleviates and the long-term forecast for production output weakens. Back to you, Michael.
Thanks, Marianne. Yes, thanks for sharing that. And now we'll take a deep dive really on Germany again, but this time we're really focusing on the impact of the tolls. We're going to look at international, but then really drill down into domestic German rates as well. And Nathan's going to share his analysis here.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So we starting off looking at this. This is basically a combination and a weighted index based on what we've seen on all of the German rates. What type of index and what trends are we seeing across the board? Now it's quite interesting. So would suggest the rates are beginning to bottom out. Now, the rates are beginning to bottom out. If we look at this, we can see that the demand pressure is definitely falling off. We've got a lot less cost pressure, and we've actually seen that some costs in Germany have surprisingly fallen in latest data. Now, this bottoming out has been helped and facilitated by an increase in costs. So we have an increase in the cost of tolls, and this has actually allowed the rate increases that we've seen here. So we've seen an increase on the spot import lanes. We've also seen an increase on both import lanes we've seen an increase on. Now this is the effect of these the older vehicles having to take on the extra cost of the new tolls, whilst actually the demand environment still remains quite poor. So it doesn't suggest that the demand environment has been strong enough to provide these cost increases, but we do see it to provide these rate increases, but we do see it as a result of the toll increase. So actually, if we go and have a look at the German domestic figure now on the next slide. So we can see it on a monthly level, and I think this provides a really good look at the effect of the tolls. So what we can see is that we had a big drop in the demand. We saw it begin to level out, and then we saw an increase around December time. Now that increase that we see has been fueled by the tolls. And actually we see that we've seen a drop off again. If we look at the latest data from March, and we've seen it drop down to 134.9 for the spot and 126.6 for the contract. So what that suggests is that the actual demand side pressure wasn't weak enough to keep these rates elevated. So we've got higher costs, and this has been incorporated, and it's inflated the rates. But actually, the demand picture suggests that even as these costs have been absorbed, the demand pressure remains low, and it wasn't high enough to keep these high. So it means that we're still seeing some low pressure. There's not an increase in the demand yet. If we look at, for instance, the indicators for retail, we still see falls. So we see a fourth consecutive month-on-month fall in retail. and that was down. It's now down 2.7% year on year from available Statis data for Q1, which means that we see it continuing. Now, German companies have been slightly improving, but the actual new orders still looks weak as well. In terms of supply, now I did mention falling costs. Now, this is interesting. So in the German market, we've got evidence of falling costs. So repair costs are down 6.7% in Q1. So outside of the toll pressure, we were actually seeing some falling pressure from other costs. But we expect it to remain stable. We see less pressure from other areas, but we're not expecting any further particular falls. And there's still possibility for it to increase later on in the year.
Thanks, Nathan. So basically, we're expecting an increase due to the tolls. We saw one in December, January, but then that's dropped off, and we think that's because of other falling costs, but also due to the demand environment being so weak in Germany. So interesting when you get into the detail to see how that actually plays out, and shows the importance of seeing the data on rate development really, as well as understanding the dynamics that are beneath it. So for our final slide, we're going to move on from the sort of more economically depressed regions of Europe. We're going to highlight the success story of recent months, looking at what's going on in Spain here. And Thomas is going to take us through this lane to finish off.
Yes, unfortunately, I will be very quick on the success story because we talked about it just previously with the slide between France and Spain, but here the story is almost the same. If we're taking the five biggest, largest economies in Europe, Spain is the only country that have seen growth in consumption over the 24 past months. Spain is experiencing growth in consumption, growth also in total manufacturing of goods, plus 2.3% year to year. And if we look at the major economy globally, the global consumption is decreasing by 5.1% 1-2 years. So it's clearly global economics that is showing that Spain is going very well. If we are looking at intra-Spain, if we're looking at exports, for instance, we see a drop in the spot prices. Contractual are quite stable, but clearly the spot one is answering to what is happening between the difference of economies between Spain and the rest of Europe.
Thank you, Thomas. And that brings us to the end of our content slides for today, and onto our Q&A session. So thank you very much all for joining us. And I can see that you've already asked lots of questions throughout the course of the webinar, some of which we've answered by text already. But we'll take your questions now. So any more questions, please feel free to plug them in, and we'll go through as many as we can. First one I can see here, that's really looking at the outlook, which is a nice way to finish off really, is from Akshata Naik, and the question is are freight rates expected to increase in Q2? Thomas, I can see you'd like to answer that one, so go ahead.
Yeah, we started, I think, a bit to answer to that one. In the report that you will receive just after the webinar, there is also outlooks of what might be the future. It's always difficult to predict the future, but what we can see, even for the months of April that just ended here, that rates are stable and on the increase for some lanes. So we should, I mean, this is probability for sure, but we should see an increase, or at least a stabilization or a slight increase of prices over Q2 and the rest of the year, if macroeconomic demands is responding as it should be, meaning increase over the months to come. And I will use this question also to answer to a new one regarding the European Bank that has announced that it will cut down the interest rates, or it will decrease the global interest rates. I've seen a question, I don't remember exactly from who, but I will answer it. What might be the impact on that? It can have clearly a good impact on the global demand, on the global economy. It can have a nice impact also for the carriers company that need to rent a truck or buy a truck with interest rates. So that should react positively to an increased demand and an increased offer, and should go in a way that prices will remain stable or increase.
Yes, that sounds like a win-win scenario, increase capacity and demand at once there. So that's great. Thank you, Thomas. Okay, we have a question now for which Marianne has asked to answer, which is in countries such as Germany and Austria, which have been the first to increase toll CO2 charges, are transport companies doing well in passing on increased costs to shippers without any problems? Well, Marianne, would you like to tackle that one?
Yeah, just because we need to be very cautious on this one. What we hear from our stakeholders is that indeed the feedback we receive that the cost is passing on today on the shippers. So we need, of course, to be careful in terms of having a global feedback, which is concerning all the different operations. But at least as of today, we understand that the cost is passing through the shippers in the current situation. So I just wanted to highlight this point here because it is one of the main question that a lot of you are wondering.
Thanks, Marianne. And then there's also another question you've sort of put your hand up for there, which is about ECMR regulations and any updates on implementation. So do you want to go ahead with that one?
So very briefly, as of today, 35 countries, in fact, because Italy is the last country that have ratified the ECMR protocol. So in total, 35 countries have ratified the ECMR protocol. So as you know, it is an amendment to the CMR that has been done in the past years, and as of today. The majority of the European countries have ratified the ECMR protocol.
Thanks, Marianne. And then a question for Nathan, saying anonymous attendee this time, but saying there's price to spot rates going down with demand in Q1 seeming to be stronger than 2023 Q1 demand and capacity tight. So Nathan, would you like to come back on that one?
Yeah, I think with this webinar, we can often, because we are often looking for the outlook and the longer picture, it's easy to forget also the regular short-term seasonal effects that we're seeing. And we've got to remember that we're coming off a peak, whilst they might not be the strongest peaks that we've had. We still have seen a seasonal rise in demand for the goods, and it did allow for rate rises and increased seasonal demand side pressure in the latest quarter. So we would expect the rates, especially the spot rates, to drop back down in Q1 following a peak time. And obviously, like I say, we focus more on that longer term trend. A lot of the numbers that we've used are seasonally adjusted. So how is the kind of the underlying strength of kind of the demand looking? But the seasonal demand did drop back off from a peak period, and that allowed for the expected fall in spot rates that we saw.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Okay, and then I think a couple of questions for you, Thomas, here. So we've got one from Thilo Kunkel saying, what about bankruptcies of forwarders? Is there a tendency, is there a trend that we can recognize here?
Yes, so on this one, I have a partial view for sure. Maybe Marianne, you have some also regarding global carriers across Europe. Regarding forwarders, what I see and what we can see on public results from big forwarders is that the year 2023 was a difficult year. Beginning of the year, it's quite hard also. If we're looking at small carriers, at least in France, we have seen an increase of bankruptcies due for sure of a strong increase in costs, insurance, the tires, costs are very high. Demand is not here. So some companies, unfortunately, need to go bankrupt, didn't have the choice. And this is a tricky question because if, as we are expecting, demand will increase in 2024 or 2025, and that here we need to have the offer that is present, and that we have these companies that are going bankrupt, this will be a shock on the other way around, and it can be a quite tricky position.
Yeah, so expecting as demand comes through, both in terms of dealing with that capacity, we're going to see some of those issues that we saw when we did have higher demand before 2023 prominently in the market, causing challenges for capacity and pushing rates up, those things coming back into play. And there's another question just below that there for you, Thomas, as well, which you to answer on do you see sustainable transport increasing rates? So what are your views on that?
On that, we are, I mean, on our side, we are getting more and more data, and we're looking also for more data to try to see what is the global markup of a B100, for instance, compared to a Euro 5 or Euro 6. It's the sustainable transport is still very small on the industry, but what we get from the market is that in the current situation, shippers are able to negotiate very good deals in which they have an increase in price for sure. I mean, the sustainability transport will go with an increase in price. For now, I think this is the more plausible, let's say. But this increase is not that high. And so many shippers are going in this direction, which is quite good globally for the investment in this sustainable transportation.
Thank you. Yes. And there's a few little questions here, just more technical, really, I suppose, about the data. So there's one question asking about data availability for Sweden. And another one I saw asking about data availability for Southeast Europe. So I don't know if you want to just quickly answer that.
I started to answer directly on the chat, but there is too many questions. Clearly, we have additional data for Sweden, for many countries that we didn't cover. If you want to have a specific sample on that, please contact me, contact Apply, or you will find us on the internet.
Yes, thanks, Thomas. And then there's another question which looks very much like it would be a good one for you, Marianne, here, which is saying, do we have a forecast regarding the hiring programs of drivers outside Europe by the great or the big carriers, or do we need to expect technology to save us from the decline in capacity in terms of the lack of drivers? So that's quite a grand question, but would you like to have a go, Marianne?
Yeah, it's a very good one. We had a webinar last year specifically on how innovation and technology can be a way to mitigate shortage, or at least to attract the profession. A lot of things are happening on the manufacturer side. Let's take the example of Scania, Iveco, are putting in place different, I would say, a new ergonomy and really improving the technology in the cabin and everything related to really the working conditions. So this is one thing, which is clearly one lever that can really be a way to attract and to improve the image. The autonomous vehicles is something that we look a lot. We don't see an impact really on the past coming years because of the situation of the implementation of the autonomous vehicle, which is not there yet. So we don't see this lever as being, I would say, a way to mitigate the driver shortage. But the first part, which is really about the technology inside the truck and everything to really improve the working conditions, yes, clearly.
Great, thanks, Marianne. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We've moved on to our contact us slide now. So if you've got any further questions, we'd love to hear from you. The IU there, Apply and TI, all details available on the screen. We'd like to carry on the conversation to answer your other questions too. But let me please thank our panelists, Nathan, Marianne, and Thomas, for their contributions today. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you'll join us again next time. Thank you and goodbye.